She said my little online thing would never amount to anything real. That was 3 months ago. Yesterday she saw my tax return. The look on her face when she realized I make more in 2 months than her precious son makes in a year, priceless. But let me start from the beginning, because this story gets so much better. I should have seen the red flags during our engagement party. While everyone else was celebrating, Patricia pulled me aside in her perfectly manicured garden and said, "I hope you're not expecting Michael to support your hobbies forever." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hobbies, that's what she called my work. The work that had already earned me 6 figures by the time I turned 25, but I bit my tongue, smiled politely, and pretended her words didn't sting. My name is Sarah, and I run a digital marketing consultancy from my home office. When I tell people what I do, their eyes usually glaze over. They picture someone posting pretty pictures on Instagram or writing cute captions for small businesses. They have no idea that I've built automated sales funnels for Fortune 500 companies, that my email campaigns have generated millions in revenue, or that I've spoken at conferences in Silicon Valley. To them, and especially to Patricia, I just play on the computer all day. Michael and I met during my final semester at business school. He was finishing his MBA, and I was already 3 years deep into building what would become my empire. He was sweet, ambitious in his own way, and most importantly, he supported my dreams when no one else did. His mother, however, was a different story entirely. Patricia Reynolds was old money wrapped in new attitudes. Her husband had built a successful law firm before he passed, leaving her with a comfortable inheritance and an inflated sense of her own importance. She lived in a sprawling colonial house in the most exclusive neighborhood in town, the kind of place where the mailboxes cost more than most people's cars. She drove a pearl-white Mercedes, belonged to 3 different country clubs, and had opinions about everything from proper table settings to acceptable career choices for women. From our very first meeting, she made it crystal clear that I wasn't what she'd envisioned for her only son. Michael was a financial advisor at a prestigious firm downtown, the kind of traditional, respectable job that looked good on Christmas cards and at cocktail parties. He wore suits to work, had business cards with embossed lettering, and could explain his career to anyone in 30 seconds or less. I, on the other hand, worked in pajamas half the time, had clients scattered across 4 time zones, and made money in ways that seemed mysterious and somehow suspicious to anyone over 50. The first time she asked what I did for work, I explained that I helped businesses optimize their digital marketing strategies to increase customer acquisition and retention. She nodded politely, but I could see the confusion and dismissal in her eyes. The second time she asked, she'd clearly forgotten my first explanation entirely. By the third time, I realized she wasn't actually listening to my answers. She'd already decided that whatever I did wasn't real work, and nothing I said would change her mind. The comments started small. Little jabs disguised as concern or curiosity. "Oh, you work from home. How nice that you can set your own schedule." The implication being that I didn't really have a schedule at all, that I was essentially unemployed with a laptop. It must be so relaxing not having a boss breathing down your neck. As if the dozens of demanding clients who expected results yesterday weren't infinitely more stressful than one predictable supervisor. But it was the engagement dinner where she really showed her true colors. Michael had surprised me with a proposal during a weekend getaway to Napa Valley, and we'd come back engaged and glowing. Patricia insisted on hosting a dinner to celebrate, inviting her closest friends and Michael's colleagues. I wore my best dress, brought expensive wine, and prepared myself for an evening of polite small talk and forced smiles. Everything was going smoothly until dessert, when Patricia's friend Margaret asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Patricia jumped in with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Sarah has a little online business. You know how young people are these days with their computers and their social media. It keeps her busy." The dismissive tone made my cheeks burn, but I forced a smile and tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. But Margaret, bless her heart, was genuinely curious. "What kind of online business?" she asked, turning to me with interest. I explained that I ran a digital marketing consultancy, that I helped companies increase their revenue through strategic online campaigns. Margaret nodded, impressed, and started asking more detailed questions about my work. I found myself relaxing, actually enjoying the conversation, until Patricia cut me off mid-sentence. "Well, it's certainly creative," she said with that same brittle smile. "But Michael has always been the practical one in the relationship. Thank goodness someone in this family has a real career." The table fell silent. Michael's face went red, and he mumbled something about both our careers being important, but the damage was done. The message was clear. I was the flighty dreamer lucky enough to have landed her responsible, successful son. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Michael slept peacefully beside me. I thought about all the late nights I'd spent building my business, all the clients who trusted me with their marketing budgets, all the strategies I'd developed that had transformed struggling companies into industry leaders. I thought about the speaking engagement I had scheduled for the following month, where I'd be presenting to a room full of executives about the future of digital commerce. I thought about the investment firm that had approached me about franchising my methods, and the book deal I was considering with a major publisher. But most of all, I thought about the number in my business checking account. The number that had grown steadily month after month as my reputation spread and my client list expanded. The number that represented not just money, but validation, proof that my little online thing was not only real, but wildly successful. I made a decision that night. I wasn't going to defend myself anymore. I wasn't going to explain or justify or try to educate Patricia about what I did. She'd made up her mind, and nothing I said would change it. But someday, somehow, the truth would come out, and when it did, I wanted to be ready. The wedding planning process was a masterclass in passive aggression. Patricia inserted herself into every decision, from the flowers to the music to the seating arrangements. She had opinions about everything, and wasn't shy about sharing them. The venue I wanted was too unconventional. The dress I loved was not quite elegant enough. The photographer whose work I admired was probably very expensive for what you get. But it was during a particularly tense meeting with the wedding planner that she delivered her most cutting blow. We were discussing the reception dinner, and I mentioned that I wanted to include a vegetarian option for my business partner Jessica, who'd be flying in from Portland. Patricia waved her hand dismissively and said, "Oh, we don't need to worry about accommodating Sarah's work friends. I'm sure they'll understand if they can't make it." The wedding planner looked confused. "But isn't this Jessica someone important in Sarah's business?" she asked politely. Patricia let out that tinkling laugh again. "Important? Oh honey, it's not that kind of business. It's more of a hobby that got out of hand. Sarah plays around on social media for small companies. Very cute, but hardly the type of thing that requires business partners." I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment and anger. Jessica wasn't just my business partner. She was a brilliant strategist who'd helped me scale my company from a one-person operation to a team of 12 contractors. She managed our West Coast clients and had a master's degree in data analytics from Stanford. The small companies Patricia was referring to included a tech startup that had just gone public and a restaurant chain with over 200 locations. But I said nothing. I sat there, smiled politely, and made a mental note to remember this moment. Because I was already planning something that would make Patricia's condescension look like a joke. The wedding itself was beautiful, despite Patricia's attempts to control every detail. Michael and I exchanged vows in front of 200 guests, and for a few magical hours, I forgot about everything except how happy I was to be starting this new chapter of my life. Patricia managed to behave herself during the ceremony, though she did make a point of introducing me to people as Michael's wife, who has a little computer business. The honeymoon in Italy was exactly what we needed. 2 weeks without Patricia's commentary, without her subtle digs about my career, without her constant reminders that I wasn't quite good enough for her son. Michael and I explored ancient cities, ate incredible food, and talked about our future together. He apologized repeatedly for his mother's behavior, promising that things would get better once she got used to having me in the family. But when we returned home, nothing had changed. If anything, Patricia seemed emboldened by our new status as husband and wife. She'd call during my work hours, knowing I was usually in meetings or focused on client projects, and when I couldn't answer, she'd leave messages about how nice it was that I could be so flexible with my time. She'd drop by unannounced, expecting me to drop everything and entertain her, then make comments about how quiet my home office was. It must be nice not having to deal with office politics and demanding schedules, she'd say, looking around at my setup with barely concealed disdain. The breaking point came 6 months after the wedding. I'd been working on a massive project for a national retail chain, developing a comprehensive digital strategy that would revolutionize how they approached online sales. It was the biggest contract of my career, worth more than most people make in 5 years, and it required me to work around the clock for 3 straight weeks. I was surviving on coffee and determination, collaborating with teams in different time zones, and managing dozens of moving pieces simultaneously. Patricia chose this week to plan a family dinner. Not just any dinner, but an elaborate affair to introduce Michael and me to some family friends who were visiting from the East Coast. She called Monday morning while I was on a conference call with the retail chain's executive team, and when I couldn't answer, she left a voicemail that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. "Sarah darling, I know you're probably not busy this week since you work from home, so I've planned a dinner for Saturday night. The Hendersons are in town, and I thought it would be lovely for them to meet Michael's wife. I've already told them all about your little online hobby, and they're dying to hear more. Please wear something appropriate, we'll be eating at 7 sharp." I stared at my phone in disbelief. Not busy. I was managing a project that could make or break a billion-dollar company's digital presence, and she thought I was sitting around with nothing to do because I worked from home. But what really got to me was the phrase, little online hobby. After 18 months of marriage, she still refused to acknowledge that what I did was legitimate work. That night, I made another decision. It was time for Patricia to learn exactly what my little online hobby was worth. I spent the rest of the week not just finishing the retail project, but also preparing for Saturday night. I pulled together documentation from my most impressive clients, revenue reports from my most successful campaigns, and testimonials from executives who'd seen their companies transformed by my strategies. I wasn't planning to wave these around like trophies, but I wanted to be prepared for whatever conversation might arise. Saturday arrived, and I dressed carefully for dinner. Not the conservative, understated outfit Patricia probably expected, but a sleek black dress that commanded attention, paired with jewelry I'd bought myself after closing a particularly lucrative deal. I looked successful, because I was successful, and for the first time in months, I wasn't going to hide it. The Hendersons turned out to be a lovely couple in their 60s. Robert was a retired investment banker, and his wife Ellen had run her own PR firm for 30 years before selling it to a larger agency. They were exactly the kind of people who would understand and appreciate what I did for a living, if given the chance to hear about it honestly. Patricia, however, had other plans. Within minutes of our arrival, she was regaling the Hendersons with stories about Michael's career achievements. His recent promotion, the important clients he managed, the respect he'd earned from his colleagues. She painted a picture of a young man destined for greatness, which wasn't inaccurate. Michael was genuinely talented and hardworking, and I was proud of everything he'd accomplished. But when the conversation turned to me, Patricia's tone shifted entirely. "And Sarah keeps herself busy with a little online business," she said with that familiar dismissive smile. "You know how young people are with their technology. She helps small companies with their websites and social media. Very creative, though I worry it doesn't provide much stability." Ellen Henderson leaned forward with interest. "Oh, how fascinating. Digital marketing is such a growing field. What kind of companies do you work with?" Sarah, she seemed genuinely curious, and I could see that Robert was paying attention too. These were people who understood business, who might actually appreciate what I'd built. But before I could answer, Patricia jumped in again. "Oh, mostly local restaurants and boutiques. Nothing too complicated, but it keeps her occupied while Michael's at work. She's very good with computers, our Sarah." The patronizing tone made me want to scream, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was exactly the opening I'd been waiting for. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice pleasant and conversational, "I primarily work with enterprise-level clients."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fortune 500 companies, mostly, though I do have a few smaller businesses that I've been with since they were startups.
I saw Ellen's eyebrows rise with interest, while Patricia's smile faltered slightly. That sounds impressive, Robert said. What kind of results do you typically see for your clients? This was exactly the kind of question I'd been hoping for. Robert understood business metrics and would appreciate real numbers. I launched into a brief overview of my most successful campaigns, mentioning specific percentage increases in revenue and customer acquisition. I talked about the tech startup that had grown from 0 to 50 million in annual revenue using my strategies, and the restaurant chain that had doubled their locations after implementing my digital marketing plan. I kept it professional and factual, but I could see both Hendersons becoming more engaged with every detail. Patricia, meanwhile, was looking increasingly uncomfortable. She kept trying to change the subject or downplay my achievements, but the Hendersons weren't having it. They were fascinated by the work I did, and kept asking more detailed questions about specific strategies and techniques. You must be incredibly busy, Ellen said. Managing that many high-level clients sounds like more than a full-time job. I nodded, explaining that I usually worked 60 to 70 hours a week, and had a team of specialists who helped me deliver results for our diverse client base. Patricia interrupted, her voice strained. You never mentioned having employees, Sarah. The skepticism in her tone was obvious, and I could see she was struggling to reconcile this new information with her preconceived notions about my work. I have 12 contractors who specialize in different areas, I explained calmly. Graphic designers, copywriters, data analysts, social media specialists. We operate more like a consultancy than a traditional agency. This was all true, and I had the tax documents to prove it. But I could see Patricia's mind reeling as she tried to process what I was telling her. Robert leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed. That's quite an operation you've built, Sarah. The overhead alone must be significant. He was testing me, I realized, trying to gauge whether I really understood the business side of what I'd created. About $40,000 a month in contractor fees, I said without hesitation. Plus software subscriptions, hardware upgrades and travel expenses for client meetings. But the margins are excellent when you're working with clients who understand the value of strategic digital marketing. I saw Patricia's face go pale as the numbers sank in. The conversation continued for another hour, with the Hendersons asking increasingly sophisticated questions about industry trends, competitive analysis, and scaling strategies. I found myself genuinely enjoying the discussion, thrilled to finally talk to people who understood and appreciated the complexities of what I did. Patricia, meanwhile, grew quieter and quieter, occasionally attempting to steer the conversation back to Michael's career, but finding little traction. As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave, Ellen Henderson pulled me aside. Sarah, I have to say, your work sounds absolutely fascinating. I'd love to refer some colleagues to you if you're taking new clients. Do you have a business card? I handed her one of my professional cards, the ones with the elegant minimalist design, and my official title, Founder and CEO Strategic Digital Solutions. Ellen studied the card carefully, then looked up at me with a knowing smile. CEO. Patricia mentioned this was a small hobby business. There was no judgment in her voice, just curiosity about the disconnect between what Patricia had told her and what she'd learned during our conversation. I glanced over at Patricia, who was helping Michael with his coat and trying to pretend she wasn't listening to every word. It started small, I said diplomatically, but it's grown quite a bit over the years. Ellen nodded, understanding immediately what I wasn't saying directly. On the drive home, Michael was quiet. I could tell he was processing everything that had happened, trying to figure out how his mother's version of my career differed so dramatically from what the Hendersons had heard. Finally, he broke the silence. Sarah, I had no idea your business was so extensive. You never talk about the financial side of things. His tone wasn't accusatory, just surprised. I realized that even my own husband didn't fully understand the scope of what I'd built. You never asked, I said gently. And honestly, I didn't want to make a big deal about it. I know your mother thinks what I do is frivolous, and I didn't want to cause more tension in the family. It was true, but as I said it, I realized how ridiculous it sounded. I'd been hiding my success to avoid hurting someone's feelings, someone who'd shown me nothing but disrespect. Michael was quiet for a moment, then reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry, he said. I should have stood up for you more. I should have asked more questions about your work. I guess I just assumed." He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. He'd assumed his mother's assessment was at least somewhat accurate. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done hiding. I was done downplaying my achievements to make other people comfortable. I was done pretending that my success was somehow less legitimate because it didn't fit into traditional categories. Patricia had spent 2 years dismissing and belittling my career, and I'd let her do it because I wanted to keep the peace. But the peace was built on lies, and it was time for the truth to come out. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after the dinner with the Hendersons, Patricia called with another one of her impromptu family gatherings. This time it was brunch to celebrate her birthday, and she wanted the whole family there. Michael's siblings would be coming with their spouses and children, plus several family friends and neighbors. It would be the largest gathering since our wedding, and Patricia was clearly planning to hold court as the matriarch surrounded by her successful children and their accomplishments. "I hope you can make it, Sarah," she said during the phone call, though her tone suggested it was more of a command than an invitation. "I know your schedule is so flexible, so I'm sure you can arrange things." There it was again, the implication that I didn't have real responsibilities or commitments. "I'll be there," I said simply. What I didn't mention was that I'd just finished the biggest project of my career. The retail chain had not only implemented every aspect of my digital strategy, but had already seen a 30% increase in online sales in just 2 months. The success had led to 3 more Fortune 500 companies reaching out about similar projects, and my projected income for the year had just jumped by another $200,000. I spent the week leading up to the brunch, making some important phone calls and sending some carefully crafted emails. I wasn't planning to ambush Patricia or humiliate her publicly, but I was going to make sure that when questions about my career came up, as they inevitably would, I was prepared with more than just polite deflections. The brunch was held on Patricia's sprawling back patio, overlooking her perfectly manicured gardens. She'd hired caterers and florists, transforming the space into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Long tables draped with crisp white linens, centerpieces of fresh roses, and enough champagne to float a small boat. Patricia loved these elaborate affairs, loved playing the role of the gracious hostess, surrounded by her admiring family and friends. I arrived wearing a dress that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, though I doubted anyone at the party would realize it. It was understated elegance, the kind of expensive simplicity that only looked casual to people who didn't know fashion. Michael had commented that morning that I looked different, more confident somehow, but he couldn't put his finger on why. The party was in full swing by the time we arrived, with Patricia holding court near the champagne fountain, regaling a group of neighbors with stories about her children's various achievements. I could hear her from across the patio, talking about Michael's latest promotion and his sister Jennifer's success as a pediatrician. When she spotted us approaching, her face lit up with her practiced hostess smile. "Sarah, darling, you look lovely," she said, air-kissing my cheeks in that affected way she'd picked up from too many country club luncheons. "I was just telling everyone about Jennifer's new practice. Isn't it wonderful when young people find their calling in life?" The implication was clear. Some people like Jennifer found real careers, while others like me just played around with computers. I smiled and nodded, making polite conversation with the neighbors, while Patricia continued her performance. I was content to let her have her moment, knowing that the day was far from over. I spotted Ellen Henderson across the patio, and waved. She and Robert had been invited as family friends, and I was genuinely happy to see them again. As the morning progressed, I found myself in several conversations about career and success. Patricia's friends and family members were accomplished people, doctors, lawyers, business executives, retired professors. They asked thoughtful questions about my work, and for the first time in Patricia's presence, I answered honestly and completely. I talked about strategic planning and data analytics. I mentioned client names that even Patricia would recognize. I discussed industry trends and future opportunities with the kind of expertise that only comes from years of hands-on experience. Patricia, meanwhile, was looking increasingly agitated. Every time she tried to minimize or redirect conversations about my work, someone else would ask a follow-up question that required a substantive answer. I wasn't showing off or being boastful, I was simply being honest about what I did for a living, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. People were starting to realize that my little online hobby was actually a sophisticated, successful business. The turning point came when Robert Henderson approached me during the cocktail hour. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation at dinner a few weeks ago," he said, loud enough for several people nearby to hear, including Patricia. "I have a client who's looking for exactly the kind of digital strategy services you provide. Would you be interested in discussing a potential project?" Before I could answer, Patricia appeared at my elbow, her smile tight and strained. "Oh, Robert, that's so sweet of you to think of Sarah's little business. But I'm sure she's quite busy with her current clients." Her tone was dismissive, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath. She was starting to realize that something didn't add up. Robert looked confused. "Little business?" "Patricia, Sarah told me she runs a consulting firm with 12 employees and works with Fortune 500 companies. That doesn't sound very little to me." The nearby conversations quieted as people turned to listen. This was exactly the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. Patricia's face went through several different expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of desperate determination to maintain her narrative. "Well, I'm sure Sarah likes to make it sound more impressive than it really is," she said with a brittle laugh. "Young people today are so good at marketing themselves. But we all know that real success takes time and experience." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel everyone waiting to see how I would respond to such a direct dismissal of my credibility. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the moment when I could finally set the record straight. But I also knew that how I handled it would define my relationship with this family forever. I took a deep breath and smiled calmly at Patricia. "You're absolutely right that real success takes time and experience," I said, my voice steady and pleasant. "It took me 7 years to build my company to its current level. 7 years of working 18-hour days, learning from mistakes, and slowly building relationships with clients who trusted me with their businesses." Patricia's smile wavered, but she pressed on. "Of course, dear, I'm sure you work very hard. But let's be realistic about the scope of what you do. It's not like you're running IBM or anything." She let out that tinkling laugh again, but this time it sounded forced and desperate. Ellen Henderson, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, stepped forward. "Patricia, I think there might be some confusion here. Sarah, didn't you mention that your company's revenue last year was over $2 million? She wasn't being malicious, she was genuinely trying to clarify what seemed like a significant misunderstanding. The number hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I saw Patricia's face go white, saw Michael's eyes widen in shock, saw the expressions of everyone within earshot change from polite interest to stunned amazement. $2 million in revenue wasn't just successful, it was the kind of success that demanded respect from anyone with basic business sense. But I wasn't done yet. Because Patricia had spent 2 years dismissing and belittling my work, and it was time for her to understand exactly what she'd been dismissing. I watched Patricia's face crumble as the reality hit her. $2 million in revenue. The number echoed across the patio, like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of whispered conversations and shocked glances. Patricia's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way her complexion had gone from rosy hostess glow to ashen disbelief. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Michael stepped closer to me, his hand finding mine. I could feel the tremor in his fingers, the way his grip tightened as if he needed something solid to anchor himself to reality. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of conversations around us.
"Is that true? 2 million? I squeezed his hand gently, my eyes never leaving Patricia's face. "Last year's gross revenue was actually 2.4 million, I said quietly, but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This year we're projected to hit 3.2 million by December." The words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well, each number creating its own splash of amazement. Patricia's best friend Margaret, who had been standing beside her with a glass of champagne halfway to her lips, slowly lowered her drink. $3.2 million, she repeated, as if saying it out loud might help her understand what she'd just heard. From a home-based business, I nodded, still maintaining that calm, pleasant expression I'd perfected over years of client presentations.
The overhead is actually quite low when you're running a digital consultancy. No physical inventory, minimal office space requirements, and most of our tools are subscription-based software. The profit margins are excellent when you know how to scale efficiently. Ellen Henderson, bless her, was nodding approvingly. That's brilliant business strategy, Sarah. Low overhead, high margins, scalable model. You've built exactly the kind of company every entrepreneur dreams of creating. She turned to Patricia with genuine curiosity. You must be so proud of what Sarah has accomplished. Patricia's response was a strangled sound that might have been intended as agreement, but came out more like the noise someone makes when they're choking on their own assumptions. She was staring at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted wings or announced I was an alien from another planet. The woman who had spent 2 years dismissing my work as a cute hobby was discovering that her son's wife was, by any reasonable measure, more financially successful than anyone else at the party. Robert Henderson raised his champagne glass in my direction. "Well, this calls for a toast," he announced, his voice carrying across the patio. "To Sarah, who's proven that the future of business is digital, innovative, and apparently much more profitable than the rest of us realized." The scattered applause that followed felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. But Patricia wasn't finished. I could see her regrouping, marshaling her defenses, preparing to find some way to diminish what she'd just learned. Her face had regained some of its color, and that familiar stubborn set to her jaw told me she was about to launch a counterattack. "Well," she said, her voice artificially bright, "revenue isn't the same as profit, of course. I'm sure once you account for taxes and expenses and all those contractors you mentioned, the actual take-home is much more modest." She was grasping at straws, but she was doing it with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades finding ways to make herself feel superior to others. This was exactly what I'd expected. Patricia couldn't accept that she'd been wrong about me, so she was going to keep moving the goalposts until she found a way to be right. But I'd come prepared for this conversation, and I wasn't going to let her twist the narrative to preserve her ego. "You're absolutely right that revenue and profit are different things," I said agreeably. "Last year's net profit after all expenses, contractor fees, taxes, and business investments was just over $800,000. I paused, watching her face carefully. "This year we're on track to clear well over $1 million in net profit." The second wave of silence was even more profound than the first. $800,000 in profit wasn't just successful, it was the kind of money that put me in the top 5% of earners in the country. More than that, it was significantly more than Michael made at his prestigious financial advisory firm, more than Jennifer made as a pediatrician, more than most of the successful professionals at this party made in their traditional, respectable careers. Michael's grip on my hand had tightened to the point where it was almost painful. I could feel him processing this information, trying to reconcile the woman he'd married with the financial powerhouse he'd apparently been living with without realizing it. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion I couldn't quite identify, "why didn't you ever tell me the specific numbers?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for months. Why had I hidden my success even from my own husband? Why had I let Patricia's dismissiveness make me feel ashamed of what I'd accomplished? "Because I didn't want money to change how people saw me," I said honestly. "I wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I earn. And honestly, I was tired of people's attitudes shifting when they found out how much money I make." Patricia had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, and now she seemed to find her voice again. "But surely you're exaggerating," she said, her tone desperate. "I mean, no offense, Sarah, but you're barely 30 years old. People don't make that kind of money from working on computers in their pajamas." The condescension in her voice sparked something inside me that I'd been keeping carefully controlled. For 2 years, I'd bitten my tongue and smiled politely while she belittled my work, my intelligence, my worth as a human being. For 2 years, I'd let her treat me like an unwelcome addition to her perfect family, someone who'd somehow tricked her precious son into marriage, despite being obviously unsuitable. But I was done being polite. I was done protecting her feelings at the expense of my own dignity. I was done pretending that her ignorance was more important than my truth. "Patricia," I said, my voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before, "I turned 31 last month. I've been building this company for 7 years, working an average of 65 hours per week, including most weekends and holidays. I have an MBA from Northwestern, 3 industry certifications, and a client retention rate of 94%. Last month alone, my strategies generated over $18 million in revenue for my clients. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the banking app I use to track my business finances. Would you like to see the actual numbers? Because I can show you real-time account balances, tax returns, profit and loss statements, whatever you need to convince yourself that this isn't some elaborate fantasy I've made up to impress your friends. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia's face had gone through several more color changes, settling on a mottled red that suggested her blood pressure was approaching dangerous levels. She was staring at my phone as if it were a venomous snake, clearly torn between her desire to prove me wrong and her growing fear that I was telling the absolute truth. That won't be necessary, Michael said quickly, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. He wanted to look, wanted to understand the scope of what I'd built without his knowledge or involvement. Sarah, I trust you completely. I wish you'd felt comfortable sharing this with me sooner. Ellen Henderson, who had been watching this entire exchange with fascination, stepped forward. Sarah, I have to ask, and please forgive the personal nature of the question, but do you mind sharing what your annual income actually is? Because if your net profit is over $1 million, and that's after paying yourself a salary. She trailed off, but the implication was clear. I looked around the patio at the faces staring back at me. These were Patricia's friends and family, people who had spent the morning hearing about everyone else's accomplishments and successes. They'd applauded Michael's promotion, celebrated Jennifer's new medical practice, and listened politely to updates about grandchildren's achievements and vacation plans. But none of those accomplishments had generated the kind of stunned attention that my financial revelations were receiving. My personal income last year was $547,000, I said clearly. This year it will be significantly higher, probably in the $700,000 range, assuming our growth projections hold steady. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. $547,000, more than $500,000 a year from my little online hobby. More money than Patricia's late husband had made as a successful attorney. More money than anyone at this party was making from their traditional respectable careers. Patricia's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the flagstone patio with a sound like breaking crystal. The noise seemed to snap everyone out of their stunned trance, and suddenly the patio erupted in conversation. I could hear fragments of amazed discussions, people trying to process what they'd just learned. Did she say $500,000? From working at home, how is that even possible? I had no idea digital marketing was so lucrative. Patricia must be so proud. But Patricia wasn't proud. Patricia was standing in the middle of her perfect party, surrounded by her carefully chosen guests, watching her worldview crumble in real time. The woman she'd spent 2 years treating like an embarrassing charity case had just revealed herself to be the most financially successful person at the gathering, and possibly in their entire social circle. Michael's sister Jennifer approached us, her expression a mixture of amazement and what looked like wounded pride. As a pediatrician, she'd always been considered the high achiever in the family, the one with the impressive career and substantial income. Sarah, she said carefully, I have to admit, I had no idea your business was so significant. When Mom described it as a small online thing, I assumed, she gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. You assumed what your mother told you was accurate, I said gently. There was no point in being angry with Jennifer. She'd simply accepted the information she'd been given. I understand completely. I probably would have made the same assumption in your position. Jennifer nodded gratefully, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was a smart woman, and she was starting to realize that if her mother had been so completely wrong about my career, what else might she have been wrong about? Can I ask what kind of companies you work with? Because this level of success suggests you must be dealing with major corporations. I was happy to answer her questions. Jennifer's curiosity felt genuine, unlike her mother's desperate attempts to find flaws in my story. I told her about the tech startup that had used my strategies to scale from zero to IPO in 3 years. I mentioned the restaurant chain that had expanded internationally based on the digital marketing framework I'd developed for them. I described the Fortune 500 retail company that had just signed a 2-year contract worth more than $1 million. As I talked, I could see Jennifer's respect growing. She was beginning to understand that what I did wasn't just lucrative, but genuinely impressive from a business perspective. I wasn't just making money, I was creating value, solving complex problems, and helping companies achieve growth they couldn't have managed without my expertise. But it was Robert Henderson who asked the question I'd been waiting for someone to pose. Sarah, given your level of success and expertise, I'm curious about your long-term plans. Are you considering expansion, maybe franchising your methods, or developing proprietary software? His question revealed that he understood the true potential of what I'd built. This was the conversation I'd been hoping to have for 2 years, the kind of sophisticated business discussion that my success deserved. Actually, yes, I said, my enthusiasm evident in my voice. I've been working with a development team to create a software platform that would allow other consultants to implement my strategies. We're also exploring licensing opportunities with larger marketing agencies who want to offer similar services to their clients. Robert's eyes lit up with interest. That's brilliant. You're not just building a service business, you're creating scalable intellectual property. The valuation potential for something like that could be enormous. He turned to Patricia, who had been standing frozen beside the broken champagne glass, and said, Patricia, you must be incredibly proud to have such an entrepreneurial daughter-in-law. This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that drives economic growth. Patricia's response was barely audible. Yes, she managed, her voice hollow, very proud. But her face told a different story. She looked like someone who'd just discovered that the person she'd been pitying was actually royalty in disguise, and she wasn't sure whether to bow or run away. Ellen Henderson, meanwhile, was pulling out her phone. Sarah, I absolutely must introduce you to my nephew. He runs venture capital fund in San Francisco, and they're always looking for companies with your kind of growth trajectory and profit margins. Would you be interested in exploring investment opportunities? Investment opportunities, venture capital, these weren't phrases that applied to little online hobbies. These were the conversations that happened around genuinely significant businesses, the kind of businesses that created wealth and employment and economic impact. The kind of businesses that deserved respect, not dismissive comments about working in pajamas. I'd be very interested, I said, accepting Ellen's business card. We're not actively seeking investors right now, but we're always open to conversations with the right partners. It felt surreal to be having this discussion at Patricia's birthday party, surrounded by the same people who had been listening to her minimize my work just hours earlier. Michael stepped closer to me, his arm sliding around my waist in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. Sarah, he said quietly, his voice full of admiration I'd never heard before. I owe you an apology. I should have understood what you were building. I should have asked better questions and paid more attention to your work. His words meant more to me than all the impressed reactions from Patricia's friends.
This was my husband acknowledging that he'd underestimated me just as much as everyone else had. You couldn't have known what you weren't told, I said softly. I kept the financial details private because I was afraid they would change how people related to me. I was afraid of being seen as the rich wife instead of just Sarah. But even as I said it, I realized how ridiculous that fear had been. I'd been so worried about being defined by my money that I'd allowed myself to be defined by other people's assumptions instead. I'd let Patricia's ignorance become the official family narrative about my career, and in doing so, I'd diminished not just my accomplishments but my own sense of worth. The party continued around us, but the energy had completely shifted. People were no longer making polite conversation about weather and vacation plans. They were asking serious questions about digital marketing, business strategy, and entrepreneurship. I found myself at the center of multiple conversations, finally able to discuss my work with the depth and complexity it deserved. Patricia, meanwhile, had retreated to a corner of the patio where she stood with a small group of her oldest friends, speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see the animated gestures and defensive posture that suggested she was trying to explain or justify something. Probably trying to figure out how to spin this revelation in a way that didn't make her look foolish. It was Margaret who finally approached me with the question I'd been expecting. Sarah dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how long have you been earning this kind of money? Because I distinctly remember Patricia mentioning that you were struggling financially, that Michael was supporting you while you got your little business off the ground. The question hung in the air like an accusation, though I could tell Margaret wasn't trying to be confrontational. She was genuinely confused by the disconnect between what Patricia had told them and what they'd learned today. It was exactly the kind of question that could expose the depth of Patricia's misrepresentations.
I've been profitable since my second year in business, I said calmly. That was 6 years ago. I crossed six figures in annual income 5 years ago, and I've been in the multiple six-figure range for the past 3 years. Michael has never supported me financially. If anything, I've contributed more to our household expenses than he has, though we've always kept our finances relatively separate. Margaret's eyebrows shot up toward her hairline, but Patricia said, she told us that Michael was carrying the financial burden while you pursued your hobby. She made it sound like you were barely breaking even. The confusion in her voice was genuine, and I could see other people nearby turning to listen to this exchange. This was the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. Patricia hadn't just been dismissive of my career, she'd been actively spreading misinformation about my financial situation. She'd been telling her friends that I was a burden on her son, a financial drain who was pursuing unrealistic dreams while he paid the bills. The lie was so complete and so malicious that it took my breath away. That's not accurate, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger bubbling up inside me. I've been financially independent throughout my marriage, and my business has been consistently profitable. I'm not sure where Patricia got the impression that I was struggling or that Michael was supporting me. But of course I knew exactly where she'd gotten that impression. She'd created it out of whole cloth, building a narrative that fit her preconceived notions about my career and my worth. She'd decided that my work couldn't possibly be legitimate or profitable, so she'd invented a story that made sense within her worldview. The fact that her story was completely false hadn't seemed to matter to her. Jennifer, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, turned toward her mother. Mom, is that true? Did you tell people that Sarah was financially dependent on Michael? Her voice carried a note of concern that suggested she was beginning to understand the implications of what her mother had done. Patricia's face had gone ashen again, but this time there was something desperate in her expression. She was trapped between her lies and the truth, with no graceful way to retreat. I may have misunderstood the situation, she said weakly. Sarah never talked about the financial aspects of her business, so you assumed that because I worked from home and didn't wear a suit to an office, I must not be making real money. I finished for her. You assumed that my work wasn't legitimate because you didn't understand it. And instead of asking questions or trying to learn more, you decided to create your own version of reality and share it with everyone you knew. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire, visible and undeniable. I could see people around us processing what they'd just heard, realizing that Patricia hadn't just been dismissive of my career, but had been actively undermining my reputation within their social circle. Ellen Henderson, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. Patricia, this is quite serious. You've been telling people that Sarah was financially unstable when she's actually one of the most successful entrepreneurs any of us have ever met. That's not just a misunderstanding, that's character assassination. Character assassination. The phrase hit like a physical blow, even though it was an accurate description of what Patricia had done. For 2 years she'd been systematically destroying my reputation within her social circle, painting me as an irresponsible dreamer who was taking advantage of her successful son. The damage she'd done went far beyond simple dismissiveness. She'd actively sabotaged how people saw me and my marriage. Michael's face had gone from confused to angry as he processed the full scope of what his mother had done. Mom, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury, how could you do this? How could you lie about Sarah to your friends? How could you make her sound like some kind of gold digger when she's been more successful than any of us? Patricia's response was a barely coherent stammer about misunderstandings and assumptions, but it was clear that she had no defense for what she'd done. She'd been caught in a web of lies so complex and malicious that there was no way to explain it away as simple ignorance or miscommunication. Robert Henderson, who had been observing this family drama with the detached interest of someone watching a particularly compelling theater performance, cleared his throat. Well, this has certainly been illuminating, he said diplomatically. Sarah, I hope you know that anyone with basic business sense can see that you've built something remarkable. Don't let anyone else's misconceptions diminish what you've accomplished. His words were kind, but they also highlighted the absurdity of the situation. Here I was, being reassured about the legitimacy of my success by people who'd just met me, while the woman who was supposed to be my family had spent 2 years actively undermining that success with lies and deliberate misrepresentations. The party continued for another hour, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Patricia moved through her own gathering like a ghost, unable to reclaim her role as the gracious hostess now that her credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed. People were polite to her, but I could see the speculative looks, the whispered conversations, the way her friends were reassessing everything they'd been told about me and my marriage. Meanwhile, I found myself energized in a way I hadn't felt in years. Finally, I was able to talk about my work with the respect and interest it deserved. People asked intelligent questions about industry trends and business strategy. They wanted to understand how I'd identified market opportunities and scaled my operations. They treated me like the successful entrepreneur I was, not like the dilettante Patricia had painted me to be. It was intoxicating, this taste of what my life could be like without Patricia's constant undermining. For the first time since my engagement, I felt like myself in a family gathering, like someone whose opinions and expertise mattered. I wasn't just Michael's wife or Patricia's disappointing daughter-in-law. I was Sarah, the CEO who'd built $1 million company from nothing. As the party began to wind down, Ellen Henderson approached me one final time. "Sarah, I want you to know that I'm going to be calling my nephew this week about that investment opportunity. What you've built is exactly the kind of innovative business model he's looking for. I suspect you'll be hearing from some very interesting people in the near future. Investment opportunities from venture capitalists." It was the kind of validation that went far beyond family drama or personal vindication. It was recognition from the business world that what I'd created had genuine value and potential. Patricia could spend the rest of her life trying to diminish my accomplishments, but the market didn't lie. The numbers didn't lie, the success didn't lie. As Michael and I prepared to leave, Patricia made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. She approached us near the front door, her face a mask of forced contrition. "Sarah dear, I hope you know that I've always been proud of your success. I suppose I just didn't understand the full scope of what you were doing." It was a pathetic attempt at backpedaling, and we both knew it. She wasn't apologizing for lying about me to her friends, or for 2 years of condescending comments and deliberate undermining. She was simply trying to rewrite history now that the truth had come out. "Patricia," I said calmly, "understanding would have required asking questions and listening to answers. Instead, you chose to make assumptions and share those assumptions with everyone you knew. That's not misunderstanding, that's willful ignorance, and it's caused real damage to my reputation and my relationship with your friends." She flinched at the directness of my response, but she didn't deny the accuracy of it. Instead, she turned to Michael with pleading eyes. "Michael, surely you understand that I never meant any harm. I just wanted what was best for you, and I was concerned about your financial stability." Michael's response surprised me with its firmness. "Mom, Sarah has never been a threat to my financial stability. If anything, she's enhanced it. But more importantly, even if she had been struggling financially, the appropriate response would have been to offer support, not to spread gossip about her supposed failures." The word gossip hung in the air like a verdict. Because that's exactly what Patricia had been doing. Spreading malicious gossip about me based on nothing more than her own prejudices and assumptions. She'd turned my career into a cautionary tale for her friends, a story about young women who think they can make money playing on computers. But the cautionary tale had backfired spectacularly. Instead of proving that traditional career paths were superior to modern entrepreneurship, my success had demonstrated exactly the opposite. I'd achieved financial independence and professional recognition through innovation and hard work, while Patricia had revealed herself to be narrow-minded and dishonest. As we drove home, Michael and I sat in silence for several minutes, both processing what had just happened. Finally he spoke. "Sarah, I owe you a huge apology, not just for not knowing about your income, but for not protecting you from my mother's behavior. I should have shut down her comments about your work from the very beginning." I reached over and took his hand. "You couldn't protect me from something you didn't fully understand was happening. But now you do understand, and now we both know exactly who we're dealing with." It was true, the events of the day had crystallized something that had been building for years. Patricia wasn't just dismissive or old-fashioned, she was actively malicious, willing to lie and manipulate to maintain her sense of superiority. What happens now? Michael asked. How do we move forward from this? It was a good question, and one I'd been thinking about throughout the drive. The revelation at the party had changed everything. Patricia's lies had been exposed, my success had been validated, and the family dynamics had shifted irrevocably. There was no going back to the way things were before, when I'd quietly endured her condescension for the sake of family harmony. Now, I said, we set boundaries. Real boundaries. No more family gatherings where I'm expected to smile politely while she undermines me. No more pretending that her behavior is acceptable for the sake of keeping peace. And no more hiding my success to make other people comfortable. Michael nodded, squeezing my hand. I support that completely. I should have supported it a long time ago. He paused, then continued. Can I ask you something? When you said your income this year would be in the $700,000 range, were you being conservative? I smiled for the first time since leaving the party. Very conservative. If the venture capital discussions Ellen mentioned go well, if the software platform launches successfully, if the licensing deals come through, we could be looking at well over $1 million in personal income this year. Michael was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information, then he started laughing, not from humor but from amazement. My mother spent 2 years worried that I'd married someone who couldn't support herself financially. Meanwhile, I married someone who's going to make more money this year than I'll probably make in the next 5 years combined. It was a sobering realization, but also a liberating one. For too long, I'd allowed other people's limited understanding to define how I saw myself and my achievements. I'd hidden my light under a bushel to avoid making others uncomfortable, and in doing so, I'd made myself smaller than I really was. But those days were over. Patricia had forced the truth into the open with her lies and manipulations, and now there was no going back.
I was successful, I was wealthy, and I was done apologizing for either of those facts. The woman who had mocked my little job was about to discover exactly how big that little job had become, and how expensive her condescension was going to be. The phone calls started 3 days later. Patricia had clearly spent the weekend doing damage control, trying to explain to her friends why she'd been so spectacularly wrong about her daughter-in-law's financial situation, but the calls weren't apologies. They were desperate attempts to regain some semblance of control over a narrative that had completely escaped her. The first call came Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly projections with my team. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to 5 minutes of Patricia's voice explaining how she'd simply been protecting the family's privacy by not sharing details about my income. According to her revised version of events, she'd known all along about my success but had chosen to be discreet. It was laughable but also infuriating in its shamelessness. The second call came that evening. This time she took a different approach, suggesting that perhaps I had overstated my earnings at the party and that she was willing to help me clarify any misunderstandings with her friends. The implication was clear. She was offering me a way to walk back my claims in exchange for pretending her lies hadn't happened. I didn't return either call. By Thursday she'd moved on to Michael. He showed me the texts she'd sent, each one more desperate than the last. She wanted to arrange a family dinner to work through this situation. She suggested that perhaps we'd all gotten carried away at the party and needed to find a more reasonable middle ground. She even offered to host a small gathering where I could explain my business in terms everyone could understand. The audacity was breathtaking. Even after being exposed as a liar in front of her closest friends, Patricia was still trying to position herself as the reasonable adult managing a situation that had gotten out of hand. She couldn't accept that there was no middle ground between her lies and my truth. Michael's response was everything I could have hoped for. He told her plainly that there was nothing to work through, nothing to clarify, and no need for explanations. Sarah's success spoke for itself, and any future family gatherings would need to acknowledge that reality from the start. The venture capital meeting Ellen had arranged exceeded every expectation I'd had. Her nephew David turned out to be a managing partner at one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious firms, and our initial video call turned into a 3-hour deep dive into my business model, growth trajectory, and expansion plans.
By the end of the conversation, he was talking about valuations that made my current success look like pocket change. What you've built is exactly what we look for, he told me as our call wrapped up, scalable, profitable, innovative, and with clear expansion opportunities. I'd like to fly out next week to meet in person and discuss our investment framework. Investment framework. The phrase sent chills down my spine in the best possible way. We weren't talking about small business loans or angel investors anymore. We were talking about the kind of institutional investment that could turn my successful consultancy into an industry-disrupting platform. I called Michael immediately after the meeting ended. How would you feel about me potentially becoming significantly wealthier than I already am? I asked without preamble. His laugh was warm and genuine. I think I'm still processing how wealthy you already are, he said. But if you're asking for my support, you have it completely. I'm proud of what you've built, and I'm excited to see where it goes next. That weekend, Ellen Henderson called with more news. The investment discussions had generated interest from 2 additional firms, and there was talk of a bidding situation that could drive my company's valuation even higher. More importantly, for my personal satisfaction, word was spreading through Patricia's social circle about the investment interest. The woman who had dismissed my work as a hobby was watching her friends learn that venture capitalists were competing to fund my expansion. The reckoning came the following Monday. Patricia showed up at our house unannounced, just like she had so many times before, but this time, instead of assuming she could walk into my home and make demands, she stood on the doorstep looking smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever seen her. "We need to talk," she said when I opened the door. Her voice lacked its usual commanding tone, replaced by something that almost sounded like pleading. "Do we?" I asked calmly. I didn't invite her in, didn't step aside to let her enter. For the first time in our relationship, she was going to have to ask for my time instead of simply taking it. "Sarah, please. I know I made mistakes, but we're family. Surely we can work past this." The word mistakes was telling. Even now she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the deliberate nature of what she'd done. "Mistakes are accidental," I said evenly. "What you did was intentional. You spent 2 years telling people I was financially unstable, that I was a burden on your son, that my work was a meaningless hobby. That wasn't a mistake, Patricia. That was a campaign." Her face crumpled slightly, but she pressed on. "I was trying to protect Michael. I was worried about his future, about his financial security. You have to understand from my perspective. From your perspective, I was someone to be managed and contained." I interrupted. "Someone whose success threatened your narrative about what constitutes real work and real achievement. So you decided to diminish me rather than acknowledge that your assumptions were wrong." Standing there on my doorstep, Patricia looked every one of her 68 years. The confident, commanding woman who had orchestrated family gatherings and social events was gone, replaced by someone who suddenly understood that her opinions and approval were no longer currency in this relationship. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally, and for the first time, there was genuine vulnerability in her voice. "Nothing," I said simply. "I don't want apologies or explanations or promises to do better. I want you to understand that your behavior has consequences, and one of those consequences is that you no longer get to have an opinion about my life or my choices." "But we're family," she repeated, as if the word were a magic spell that could undo everything that had happened. "Family is supposed to support each other," I replied. "Family is supposed to celebrate each other's successes, not undermine them. Family is supposed to tell the truth, not spread lies to make themselves feel superior. You've shown me very clearly what your version of family looks like, and I'm no longer interested in participating." Patricia's face went through several emotions: shock, anger, desperation, and finally something that might have been understanding. "You're cutting me out of your life." "I'm protecting myself from someone who has proven to be untrustworthy and harmful," I corrected. "If you want to interpret that as being cut out, that's your choice." She stood there for a long moment, clearly hoping I would soften, would offer some path back to the relationship we'd had before. But there was no going back. The woman who had mocked my little job had revealed too much about her character, had done too much damage to too many relationships. "The Hendersons' investment firm called me," she said suddenly, apparently deciding to try a different approach. "They wanted a character reference for you. I suppose I should ask what you'd like me to tell them." It was a transparent attempt at leverage. a suggestion that she still had some power in this situation. But her timing was terrible because David Henderson had already told me about that call. He'd wanted to understand the family dynamics before moving forward with the investment, and Patricia's response had been illuminating. "I know exactly what you told them," I said with a slight smile. "David shared your comments with me. Apparently, when pressed for specific examples of my work or achievements, you had very little to offer. Mostly just vague concerns about stability and reliability, which he found inconsistent with the evidence." Patricia's face went pale as she realized her attempt at manipulation had backfired. The investment firm hadn't been seeking her approval, they'd been testing her credibility, and she'd failed that test as completely as she'd failed every other test of character over the past 2 years. "They're still planning to invest?" she asked weakly. "They've increased their offer," I said matter-of-factly. Apparently David was impressed by my professionalism in not letting family drama affect my business relationships. He said it demonstrated exactly the kind of level-headed leadership they look for in entrepreneurs. The irony was perfect. Patricia's attempts to undermine me had actually enhanced my reputation with the people whose opinions mattered for my future. Her lies and manipulations had backfired so completely that they'd become evidence of my character and resilience. "Sarah," she said one last time, "surely there's some way we can move forward from this." I looked at her standing on my doorstep, this woman who had spent 2 years trying to make me small, trying to convince everyone around us that I was unworthy of respect or consideration. She wanted forgiveness without accountability, reconciliation without change, a return to the status quo that had served her so well. "There is a way forward," I said finally. "But it doesn't include you. You made your choice about what kind of relationship you wanted with me, and now I'm making mine. I choose to surround myself with people who celebrate my success instead of undermining it, who build me up instead of tearing me down, who see my worth instead of inventing reasons to dismiss it." I stepped back and began closing the door. "Goodbye, Patricia. I hope you find whatever it was you were looking for when you spent all that time trying to diminish me. But you won't find it here anymore." The door clicked shut with a finality that felt like the end of a chapter. Through the window, I watched Patricia stand there for several more minutes, as if she couldn't quite believe that her tactics had finally stopped working. Eventually she turned and walked back to her car, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen her. Michael found me in my office an hour later, working on contracts for the expanded business that Patricia would never understand or appreciate. "How do you feel?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Free," I said, without hesitation. "For the first time since we got engaged, I feel completely free to be myself without worrying about someone else's approval or disapproval." The investment deal closed 6 weeks later. The valuation exceeded even David's optimistic projections, and suddenly I wasn't just successful. I was wealthy in a way that would reshape every aspect of our future. The company that Patricia had dismissed as a hobby was now worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. We moved to a larger house in a better neighborhood, not because we needed to impress anyone, but because we could. I hired a full-time staff, expanded into new markets, and started planning the kind of strategic initiatives that only became possible with serious capital backing. Patricia heard about the investment through her social network, of course. In a town like ours, that kind of financial success doesn't stay secret for long. But she didn't call or stop by or attempt to repair the relationship. Perhaps she finally understood that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. The last I heard of her, she was telling people that she'd always known I would be successful, that she'd seen my potential from the very beginning. It was a final revision of history, a last attempt to claim some credit for something she'd actually tried to destroy. But the people who mattered knew the truth, and her revisionist narrative fooled no one who had witnessed her behavior firsthand. 6 months later, my company was featured on the cover of a major business magazine. The article called me one of the most innovative entrepreneurs in the digital marketing space, and the interview covered everything from my strategic vision to my expansion plans. There was even a sidebar about successful business models that could be replicated by other entrepreneurs. I kept a copy of that magazine in my desk drawer, not out of vanity, but as a reminder that success isn't defined by other people's understanding or approval, a reminder that sometimes the people who try hardest to diminish us are actually revealing their own insecurities and limitations, and most importantly, a reminder that we teach people how to treat us, and we have the power to change that dynamic whenever we choose. The woman who had mocked my little job was nowhere to be found when the real recognition came. But that was fine with me. I'd learned something valuable from her behavior. The people who matter will celebrate your success, and the people who don't celebrate your success don't matter. Patricia had made her choice about which category she belonged in, and I'd made mine about what kind of people deserved space in my life. My little job had grown into an empire, and the empire had grown into freedom. Freedom from small-minded people who couldn't see past their own assumptions. Freedom from relationships built on diminishment and control. Freedom to be exactly as successful as my talent and work ethic would allow, without apologizing to anyone for achieving more than they thought I deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.